Good afternoon, everyone. My name is General Jim Jones. I'm the Executive Chairman Emeritus of the Atlantic Council. And I'd like to welcome you all to this virtual event hosted by our Forward Defense team, titled Countering New Threats to the Homeland, the Future of the Department of Homeland Security. Forward Defense, our new U.S. defense practice area in the Scowcroft Center, helps the United States and its allies and partners contend with great power competitors and maintain favorable balances of power. Our forward defense practice produces forward-looking analyses of the trends, of the technologies, and the concepts that will define the future of warfare and the alliances needed for the 21st century. Through the futures we forecast, the scenarios we wargame, and the analyses we produce, forward defense develops actionable strategies and policies for deterrence and defense while shaping U.S. and allied operational concepts and addressing the most significant defense challenges at the heart of great power competition. 19 years ago, the attacks of September 11th, 2001 brought home the dire threat of terrorism to the American people in ways that we still are struggling to comprehend. And it brought home the need for drastic reform to the national security establishment. In the aftermath of 9/11, the US federal government combined more than a dozen agencies under the newly established Department of Homeland Security. And since 2003, threats to the homeland have changed. COVID-19 pandemic, a disease with enormous public health threats like election interference and disinformation are increasingly important and will continue. But in order to do so, DHS needs to take a hard look at its internal problems, including management reform and resolving workplace issues to improve morale. Today's event will include 3 panel discussions and other remarks, and so we've got a lot in store for you. We will also hear from the report authors on the key recommendations in the study, and then we'll hear from 3 very, very distinguished Americans, former DHS secretaries who served on the project's senior advisory board, my fellow Atlantic Council Board Director, Michael Chertoff, Janet Napolitano, and Secretary Jay Johnson. And finally, be sure to stick around for the last panel focused on the critical relationship between public and private sector actors. Before I turn it over to Clementine Starling, I would like to remind everyone that this event is public and on the record. We encourage our audience on Zoom to ask questions of the panelists by using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll be collecting these questions and answering some of them through the course of the event. Since this is a public event, please be sure to identify your name and affiliation with each question you submit. We also encourage our audience to join the discussion on Twitter at AC Scowcroft using our hashtag #ForwardDefense. Thank you very much. And without further ado, Clementine, over to you.
Thank you, General Jones, for that great introduction and powerful reminder of this week's anniversary of 9/11. Welcome, everyone. I'm Clementine Starling, the Deputy Director of the Scowcroft Centers for Defense Practice. I wanted to start off by congratulating the team here on publishing our landmark Future of DHS report. It's a truly comprehensive assessment of the future of the department and the need to reshape DHS's mission around emerging threats. It went live this morning, so I encourage you all to read it on our website. So today, I'm thrilled to moderate our first discussion on the future after the future of DHS, emerging threats and the American public. And I'm joined by 2 esteemed guests, both non-resident senior fellows of Forward Defense. They're creator, writer, and director of Call of Duty Black Ops and CEO of Deviation Games, Dave Anthony, and author of World War Z and the recently published Devolution, Max Brooks. Max, Dave, thank you for joining us. You 2 are certainly some of the most creative people I know, and you both spend your days thinking about how the world's changing And you've both been very successful at applying novel tools like gaming and fiction to imagine the future. So I could think of two better people to dig into this discussion with us. Just as a reminder before we delve in, I'd please encourage our audience to pose questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom. We only have 25 minutes in this first session, but I'll try and pose as many of your questions as I can. So Dave, Max, let's jump right in. This question of emerging threats and their impact on the homeland is a really critical one, and it's something we address in the report. The United States used to be protected from attack by two oceans. September 11th showed that terrorists could use non-military means for civilian aircraft to kill more Americans than were killed at Pearl Harbor. And today, we face a spectrum of below-threshold threats in the cyber, information, commercial domains that really bring security challenges to the US's doorstep. And General Jones kind of touched on a number of them. So Dave, maybe I can kick it to you first. I'd be interested to hear how you think Homeland Security has evolved in the last 19 years. What are the security challenges that the US faces today that most concern you?
Sure. In terms of how it's evolved, I think given the threats that we're currently facing and how difficult they are to predict, I think evolved might be generous. I think the types of things that are being thrown at us are very, very, very difficult to predict. And, look, I make video games and, we spend time coming up with all these crazy scenarios of, oh, this can happen, that can happen. And, the secret is, of course, we never believe it's going to happen. But I've got to tell you, there was a moment this year when I very specifically asked myself a question. I was watching something happening, live on the news channel. Like, could our democracy actually fail? Like, that type of threat is something that had never occurred to me as a possibility before. So, I was chatting to the council about this sort of thing. And I watched this documentary called The Unknown Known, which I think was Donald Rumsfeld's answer to the fog of war. It was a very interesting documentary. I'm not sure I agreed with everything in there, but one thing he highlighted Pearl Harbor as a failure of imagination. And I think you guys actually included in the blurb for this event that, the 9/11 Commission said the greatest failure for 9/11 was a failure of imagination. So I asked myself, since 9/11, what's been the next failure of imagination? And I think there's a case to be made that, the ramifications, basically in 2016, the ramifications of electing a president who just refuses to play by the established rules of democracy, and what could possibly happen as a result of that, is another failure of imagination, and perhaps the greatest one so far. We're in 2020. We have, a 9/11 death toll every 4 days. So it's not only that these failures of imagination keep happening, but they're getting worse. And the gaps between them, like the time frame between them, the number of years is getting smaller. So that's not a good trend. And I think that's why everybody really needs to pay attention today, because we're not going to keep getting away with this. At some point, something really bad is going to happen. And I'm going to steal a quote from the council's Barry Pavel, so I don't tell him. But he said to me yesterday, "This is not a call to arms. It's a call to imagination." And I think that's how we desperately need to look at this.
It's really interesting. So Max, I want to bring you in here because I know you've put a lot of thought into this too, and using kind of creative tools to really get at some of those more imaginative pieces, some of those elements that seem unimaginable previously, but are, in some respects, our reality today. Max, you've previously remarked on how the US's adversaries, notably China and Russia, have gone to school on the American way of warfare. So is the US, in this moment in time, is really adapting to an era of great power competition? Is our national security toolbox today equipped to tackle these challenges? Do we have Max?
Sorry about that. I was going to say that we have what is called an imagination gap with our enemies, the same way that we had a missile gap with the Soviets in the 1960s. And that all goes back to the worst war we ever fought, which was Desert Storm. And while that was seen as a victory for us, it was a crushing defeat of imagination. Because what happened was we thought we were teaching our enemies not to confront America. We were fighting a war of deterrence. We thought the message was to our enemies, our frenemies, and our future foes, if you confront the United States on the battlefield, we will utterly destroy you. And we thought that would deter aggression. What we didn't understand was the lesson we were teaching our enemies was don't confront us on the battlefield. Develop alternative means to go over, to go under, to go around, or to go through without being noticed. This Maginot Line of military might that we have been building since the end of World War II. And that's what's been happening. Since the 1990s, our enemies have been developing asymmetric means to get America off the world stage because we pushed them into that. And that is why the Department of Homeland Security has now been catapulted from rear guard to front line, because our enemies have learned to go right over our military might and penetrate the heartland directly. Cyber, information, economic, and now biological. Because even though COVID-19 might be natural, it has done what Admiral Gorshkov's massive Soviet fleet could never do. Take an American nuclear supercarrier off the high seas. And you can't tell me right now that other countries and non-state actors haven't recognized the power of the germ and are trying to harness it the way we did before the Second World War and during the Cold War. So we have an imagination gap right now. We have been developing a bigger, badder way of fighting Desert Storm, while our enemies have been developing a hydra to go all the way around and get at us directly. And that is why now DHS is the primary frontline defense against our enemies.
I think that's a really fantastic way to describe it in a lot of ways. I think that Homeland Security has moved from being in the rear to the front. And what this is, I think what you've both touched on a little bit is really, it's difficult to untangle domestic and international threats now. You know, physical borders, physical boundaries no longer exist in the age of information that we're in. So how do we get about formulating solutions to try and tackle these threats? If security abroad is being kind of fought, if being fought on the homeland, if our adversaries are taking advantage of our strengths, how can we rewrite our own playbook to be able to tackle these kinds of threats, do you think?
That's exactly what we need, Clementine. You hit the nail on the head. We need a new playbook. The same way after the Second World War, we developed an entirely new grand alliance in order to defend ourselves from communism and an entire strategy of how to go about it. We developed things like flexible response and the NATO alliance. We don't have any of that now. If you just take the sliver threat of cyber attack, we have no grand cyber doctrine. If you look in the National Response Framework, there is no delineation of responsibility and of resources. And we have no international treaties for how to respond to a cyber attack. If, let's say, Vladimir Putin decides to shut off the power grid in Vilnius, just to shut down an anti-Putin rally, to teach him a lesson. But in doing so, that power grid shuts off the power for hospitals and patients die. He is as directly responsible for killing citizens of a NATO ally as if he sent a backfire bomber to drop a bomb on those hospitals. We have no legal framework. We have no flexible response. We have no tiered response. So right now, with cyber, we have left it up to the minds and the whims of whomever is in power. And as a citizen of the United States, talking to someone with a British accent, between our president and your prime minister, that is a very, very scary scenario.
Dave, I want to give you the opportunity to jump in, or I can ask another question.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think like Max says, we don't have a playbook and we need one. So how do you get one? You know, how do you get a playbook which can deal with these kinds of threats which could come from anywhere? Now, look, Max and I are both created, and I'm biased, so I'll give you a creative idea. You know, if you look at some of our enemies and the techniques they've been using, take 9/11 as an example. It's like they've hired some, you know, failed Hollywood scriptwriter to come up with an idea on, you know, how you could take down America. And, you know, I just wonder if an idea might be, you know, there's a lot of great creative minds around the world, and they put all their energy into creating entertainment. You know, I wonder if you could take, you know, some of those best minds, put them in a room for a year with some Washington folks, you know, have them brainstorm just every possible, you know, implausible scenario they can think of. And every time one of those scenarios comes up and you think that's absolutely preposterous, that couldn't happen, then you know you're onto something. So you get them in a room, you get them to come up with all these ideas, and then you get the Washington folks to say, well, you know, get them to say, well, how would they solve that? Get all the solutions down to all these things, and then look for consistencies between them. Look for the consistencies in all these different kind of things. Oh, that solution is the same as that solution. That solution is the same as that solution. And then maybe take a framework like that and try and figure out, okay, how could we do a radical rethink of how we're approaching, you know, homeland security? And of course, you know, the government is like a battleship, right? It turns very, very slowly. You can't just replace everything. But I think at the very least, that might inspire some thinking as to how things could be looked at a little differently.
I'd like to go just one step farther on that, in that Dave and I both understand the creative process. And I think we both understand that creativity is the first link in a very long chain in order to turn dreams into reality. Because I can tell you, working at the Modern War Institute at West Point, I've met some of the most brilliant creative minds of my entire life. However, good ideas are meaningless without the courage to champion them. Because you can have all the good ideas in the world, and we have. The United States Army has reports of Somalia that would have been the playbook in Iraq if someone had had the courage to champion them, and they didn't. We had the playbook on fighting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s, but nobody had the courage to champion it. This is one of the key problems, is ideas need the oxygen of courage. And if you don't have a system that rewards that courage, it won't matter how creative you are. Things will never get done. This is another thing that needs to happen. Bringing the creative people in is great, but then you need the people with the spine and the intestines to stand up and say, we need to champion this. And this may mean my job. This may mean my career. This may mean being ridiculed, because we know psychologically the number one fear of most human males is ridicule. It's in the Geneva Convention, outrages upon human dignity. If we don't address that, if we don't find the champions and cheerleaders that are willing to embrace and fight for these ideas, they will end up, as they say in Hollywood, on the cutting room floor.
I want.
Sorry,
Dave.
I was going to say I couldn't agree more. And you know, this country has and the government particularly has the agility of a petrified tree. And what you desperately need in this situation, and I think what Max is talking about, is agility. You need people who can affect these changes. And you know, I'll give you a quick video game example of what I'm talking about. I used to be the cool father at school because of Call of Duty, and along came this game called Fortnite, which took over the world. And what that company did, Epic Games, the CEO, Tim Sweeney, is a genius. He's a programmer. And he's the most agile leader I've ever seen. And he makes decisions very quickly and very smartly with the right people around him. And he knows how to take a battleship and he knows how to turn it quickly. And agility in that respect is something that is going to be absolutely crucial to meet these challenges which are coming towards us.
Yeah. Clementine, let's just all remember, everyone who's watching, that there was a plan for COVID-19. It is the biological annex of the National Response Framework. So that COVID is not a failure of imagination. We're ready. I've been part of exercises where I've actually seen the responses. We're trained, we're prepared, they're funded. What happened? So that was not a failure of imagination. That was a failure of agility and guts.
I think on that point, Max and Dave, I'd be interested to hear, this report really focuses on adapting DHS to the challenges we face in 2020. But as we know, bureaucracy is slow to move. So I'd be interested to hear from you both, what are the future challenges of the future of DHS that we need to be adapting to? The challenges in 2030. I mean, Max, you wrote World War Z about a bioterror scenario before we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're seeing how that's playing out. I'd be really interested to hear what you think of those aspects that we need to be adapting to and thinking about now, those crazy ideas that could play out.
Clementine, we need to reabsorb the hard truths about soft power. The United States used to be the master of soft power, and we have completely dismantled that in favor of lethality, simple military lethality. Our enemies are ramping up, and once again, they are 20 years ahead of us. The Chinese have become the masters of soft power. This is why they are buying up media companies like there's no tomorrow. This is why they've bought companies like Grindr, so they can patrol all of the members and use compromat on anybody in a position of power. This is why they pressure Hollywood movies to parrot their agenda. I don't know about Dave. I can tell you they tried to censor my book, World War Z, because I was critical of their government. And therefore, I lost access to a potential billion readers. I don't know in Dave's position, but I remember video games in the 1990s. There were tons of them where you could play for or against the People's Liberation Army, from People's General to Tom Clancy's SSN. Where are they? Where are they now? So soft power infects every aspect of society. If you want access to Chinese markets, you have to play by their game. And Western companies are by nature global companies. So they are much more vulnerable to manipulation than we believe. We've seen it with the NBA. We see it now all over the world with infrastructure programs. So I think we need to really get serious about soft power, how our enemies are using it, and what it's going to mean for a free and open democratic society to remain free.
We could keep going. I want to make sure that we add one or two audience questions in here. So we have an interesting one from Ricardo Atarola of the Embassy of Costa Rica to the US, I believe. He asks, is the increasing use of cryptocurrencies something that can be cataloged as a threat for its possible effects in the global financial system and its possible use in illegal international trade? What can be done about it?
Well, cryptocurrency is a fascinating space, and it's based on a technology called blockchain, which is the technology itself is actually extremely secure, and that's part of the reason why it's been so, successful and prevalent in these new currencies that have come out. In terms of how that can affect the future and security, I don't think anybody really knows. I can tell you the financial system itself right now, under its current form, feels to me very, very fragile. The stock market is essentially run probably 60, 70% by AI now. And you can see with what's happening right now with the current climate, the madness of where the stock market is versus where the country is right now. These things, don't connect. This financial system is still based on, thousands of years old system of, trading things and assigning value to it. And this thing, who knows how long that has left. So I think these cryptocurrencies are going to be very important for the future. We just need to be sure that we have the right people in control of them.
Yeah, I'll jump on with that, just saying that I think that this is part of the bigger issue, is that the old national defense model of 1945 was that everything was connected, that every institution had a national security element to it. And therefore, even in the business world, there was always the idea of how do our transactions affect our safety? And we still have this. We still have CFIUS. Sounds like a venereal disease, but it actually is the committee to decide, does every transaction affect national security? And we are asleep at the switch. You look at small things like Monsanto, that now patents seeds, that farmers can't grow their own food anymore. They have to buy the seeds now every year, which means that Monsanto was sold to a foreign company, which could then sell it to China. And if that happens, the United States, for the first time in its history, will be vulnerable to food blackmail. So the idea of analyzing all our systems now and seeing what the national security risks are have to be part of DHS.
Perfect. Well, we could go on, but we're at time. Maybe I'll just give you both the opportunity to provide some concluding thoughts. And I might tie in one kind of final question that I've seen pop up in the audience questions, which is about disinformation. Johannes Allerfeld states, our enemies are taking advantage of the principles of the open society, freedom of speech. And disinformation is prevalent, as we know, across social media. How can we counter these threats without undermining the foundations of our own society and lifestyle? And I'll tack on to that, how can we use novel communication tools, given that communication is such a crucial part of this, communicating these threats to the American public? What do you both think about kind of this core challenge that I think we've seen is really at the heart of a lot of issues we face today?
Well, disinformation attacks America's greatest strength, which is the American people. That is America's greatest strength. And what we need to do is we need to develop a defense-first strategy where we build strength from within. Because if the American people are strong, then everything else will follow. And I think what DHS needs to pay very, very clear attention to, because the American people right now are very fractured, is they need to pay attention to the conditions which breed internal threats. And I'm talking about things like, poverty, identity, polarization, us versus them. All of these things are things which need to be very, very clearly identified and reinforced, because, you asked about potential future threats. What could they be? Per what I was talking about earlier, where, the most preposterous ideas are the ones that you need to be concerned about. If things go worse, it could end up being civil war or revolution. I saw a guy in LA on TV a few months ago with a shotgun with an ammo belt strapped around him, talking to police who didn't arrest him. Like, things can go bad, and strength from within, defense first, is, I think, what we need to do.
When it comes to disinformation, I was most shocked by an Atlanta Council meeting that we had, where the council brought in someone from the previous administration who was transitioning from government to the social media companies, sort of in the way that the military has generals then go and work for the military industrial complex. And his defense, and I'm not kidding, was, hey, when it comes to misinformation, we're just the carton. We're not responsible for the eggs. That's absolute bullcrap, because that is the exact defense that the auto industry used in the 1960s when consumer advocate groups were trying to force them to make their cars safer. Their attitude was, we just make the cars, we're not responsible for how you drive them. Because just like the social media companies, they don't want to spend the money. We can vet every user on Facebook or Twitter or any platform. It is very easy to figure out, is this an actual person? Is it a bot? Is it in a Russian troll farm? We can do this. They can do this. but they are simply greedy and do not want to spend the money. And if we force them, if DHS forces them the same way we forced the auto industry in the 60s, they will kick, they will scream, then they will comply, and then we will be safer.
Thank you both. Well, we're at time. We could really go on for another half an hour. But Max, Dave, thank you. This has been a really tremendously fruitful discussion. A really important reminder, I think, of the challenges that we face today. And Max, as you pointed out, how departments like DHS can really help us adapt to meet them. So to walk us through the insights and the recommendations in the report, I will hand to Tom Warwick, one of the co-directors of the Future of DHS project. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Clementine. Thank you, Dave and Max, for starting us off. I'm Tom Warwick, director of the Future of DHS project. I do want to thank our senior advisory board, secretaries Chertoff, Napolitano, Johnson, Beers, and McAleenan for their guidance and leadership. And thanks also to the more than 100 Homeland and national security experts who helped us formulate our ideas, many of whom are in the virtual audience today. So I really do want to say thank you very much. This really was an enormous team effort to be able to put together the report, the full version of which is now on the Atlantic Council website. What we wanted to try to do first was to take a step back and take a perspective from January 2021, regardless of who would win the 2020 election. Because things have changed a lot from what they were on 9/11, which we commemorate this week, or even recently as a few years ago. And so we took a look at what the major threats were and then tried to see what DHS should do in response to some of these non-military threats. Clearly, as everyone here, I think, appreciates, the most urgent threat today is COVID-19. DHS was created to prevent another attack as devastating as 9/11. But from July 15th until September 6th, COVID-19 was killing more people than 9/11 every 4 days. Even today, when the death toll has declined somewhat, according to the University of Washington's best case model, which was released after our report was finished, we're still looking at 35 more 9/11s between now and the end of the year. And that's the best case. The most likely case is 76 more 9/11s. Nothing should motivate the Department of Homeland Security more to pull out all the stops. DHS has worked hard on COVID-19, and credit due to those who have done that, but DHS clearly needs to do a lot more to take a leadership role to mobilize and prioritize distribution of testing and medical supplies, and eventually a vaccine, and to coordinate and help fund infrastructure changes that are going to be necessary to make our schools, factories, nursing homes, and offices safe. The second threat is a long-term threat to critical infrastructure from climate change or extreme weather, the results of which, as we saw with the recent hurricane that a few miles offshore Texas was a Category 1, but was a Category 4 by the time it hit because of environmental factors. We have in the next panel two of the country's leading experts in the secretaries who have spoken out often about the importance of preparing America to defend itself from the threat to infrastructure from climate change. But more immediately, we believe that the United States needs to do more to focus on non-military threats from nation states. Today, experts in and out of government agree that Russia, China, and Iran are carrying out non-kinetic attacks, whether it's through cyber operations, challenging US election security, attacking our critical infrastructure, carrying out acts of disinformation, trying to undermine confidence in the American judicial system, manipulating social media through covert influence campaigns, and other means. The experts don't agree on what to call this: hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare, active measures. But all of these things, whatever they are, exploit American weaknesses, especially lack of US strategic patience, political and social divisions, the vulnerability of civilian targets because they attack civilian targets, not military targets, with the goal to try to weaken American power. Right now, no one department actually owns the defense of the United States against this new style of warfare. The best fit, we believe, is the Department of Homeland Security, which has more of the individual elements of this than any other. Cybersecurity and election security are in DHS's wheelhouse. DHS has a greater capability to engage with the state and local and private sector, as my colleague Caitlin Durkovich will tell in just a second. Even so, DHS is going to need more people and resources if it's going to engage in this kind of a fight. It's going to need to try to the greatest extent possible to be nonpartisan in the tradition of the US military and the US intelligence community. At the same time, DHS is also going to have to do all of its current missions because none of DHS's other missions have gone away. So in our eyes, if the Department of Defense mission is described with a bumper sticker, "We fight and win America's wars," DHS's is to think of its mission that we lead the defense of the nation against non-military threats. That's what we think the top priorities are for DHS's mission. Let me turn it over to Caitlin Durkovich to talk about public-private partnerships and DHS's relationship with the private sector.
Tom, thank you very much. And I'd like to echo my thanks to the Atlantic Council, to former secretaries and officials who've been involved in this project. It's really been a very rewarding effort to be part of. And I am pleased to have led the section on the unique public-private partnerships and how we think about those public-private partnerships moving forward in light of the threats that Tom has described. Protecting American democracy and building a resilient homeland is a shared endeavor that includes many stakeholders, not just the Department of Homeland Security. And while it is the lead federal partner in the Homeland Security mission, there are others who are on the front lines, as Max Brooks alluded to. That includes our state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and our industry partners, to include the owners and operators of critical infrastructure. And I think it is that very enterprise, when you think about the need for imagination. And in fact, if you were to read the 9/11 report and scroll down even further, you would see that there is a call to routinize, if not even bureaucratize, imagination to deal with emerging threats. And it is this stakeholder community that includes DHS and other federal agencies, state and local, and industry, I think, that can help, if better leveraged, address both current threats but future threats. And it is from that perspective that we both address our findings and look at recommendations. Key to our findings is certainly the acknowledgement that information sharing has been the cornerstone of one of the core capabilities of the Department of Homeland Security. It is a capability that needs to be matured and modernized, given the range of threats that we're facing, the speed and intensity in which we have to deal with them, and the recognition that not all companies are equal and that they have different risk profiles. The second consideration is how do we continue to incentivize our state and local partners and the private sector to continue to invest in mitigating threats and enhancing the overall security of our country. And that's really the focus of the recommendations that we have. We unfortunately don't have time to go into all of the recommendations, but as Tom alluded to, the report has been published. There's a series of recommendations, from information sharing to incentivization. And when we turn to the private sector panel towards the end of this session, we will look at those in more depth. And so, Tom, with that, I will turn it back to you to talk about parts 3 and 4, and then we'll go to Nick.
So our report also has a section devoted to DHS's management challenges, for which we believe improving DHS's morale is the most important priority. And there actually are more success stories than many people would give DHS credit for, and they deserve attention. There are other management issues. Please look at the report. What I do want to do now, though, is introduce Nick Miroff to start off our next panel, all of whom I've had the pleasure of working with. Nick Miroff is a reporter for the Washington Post who covers the Department of Homeland Security and immigration issues. He's won numerous prizes for his reporting. And those of us who followed the Homeland Security beat that Nick and his colleagues have been covering know what an outstanding job Nick has been doing. So with that, Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Caitlin, as well, and Atlantic Council and the Scowcroft Center for organizing this event and for inviting me. I think it's a fascinating and urgent discussion as we look forward to what may happen over the next couple months and at a time of great anxiety and uncertainty in our country. You know, today was another wild day in DHS land. We saw Acting Secretary Chad Wolf's State of the Homeland speech this morning at DHS headquarters. A very pointed speech in defense of the Trump administration's record. And then my colleague Shane Harris and I have a story just now about whistleblower Brian Murphy's complaint, laying out several allegations that he was pressured to sort of change reports and play down the threat of Russian interference in the election. So, you know, just another, you know, very tumultuous day. And it got me thinking about the new Homeland Security headquarters there in Southeast Washington. Anybody who's ever been there, I think, is impressed by its view and the kind of command post that it has overlooking the nation's capital. And I think in a lot of ways that symbolizes the spirit of the department and the you know, purpose for which it was created. But you know, you're also reminded that it's the former site of St. Elizabeth's Hospital. It was you know, it's been a mental hospital for 150 years, and so you know, that's a way to kind of bring us, I think, to this juncture. You know, is the future of DHS going to be one that sees the department stabilized after a period of great instability under the Trump administration? And so I'm very much looking forward to the thoughts of our next panelists. We are fortunate to have 3 former Homeland Security secretaries with us. I'll note that, you know, during the past 3 years, we have had 5 different leaders at DHS, but the 3 secretaries you're going to hear from spanned 12 years of the young institution's existence. So that's a lot of institutional knowledge that and experience that we can tap into. I'm going to just briefly introduce them, even though everyone already knows who they are. We're going to be joined by former Secretary Michael Chertoff. He's the country's 2nd Homeland Security Secretary and the founder and executive chairman of the Chertoff Group. He's also the board director at the Atlantic Council. We also have with us former Secretary Janet Napolitano. She's the 3rd DHS secretary. She's now a professor of public policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. Go Bears. And we're also going to be joined by former Secretary Jay Johnson, the 4th Homeland Security Secretary, and partner at Paul, Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. And for starters, I think, you know, the question I want to pose is the one that's on everyone's mind. What is the future of DHS under a Biden administration? And what is the future of DHS under a 2nd Trump term? Can the department continue this way? I think we'll go in chronological order, if it's okay with everyone. And I'd like to invite former Secretary Chertoff to take that and lead our discussion.
You know, I think if Joe Biden becomes president, we'll see DHS return to the kind of normality that it experienced under the 3 people on this panel. It'll be focused on the mission. It'll be not just about building walls at the border, but it'll be a broader sense of what you need to protect the country against non-military threats, including dealing with natural disasters, which we've had a rash of. Not just the pandemic, but look what's going on in California, as Janet knows. I think if Trump gets reelected, it kind of exceeds my imagination. Clearly, what's happened is he's done everything he can to cripple the leadership of the department by not allowing anybody to occupy the position permanently. I know there are many fine people who work at the level below the front office who are dedicated to their jobs and do a good job. But the more there is a sense that you have a president who wants to politicize a department like this, the harder it's going to be to retain people and the harder it is to retain public trust, which for DHS is critical if it's going to carry out its mission.
Secretary Napolitano?
Yeah, I think I have to agree with Secretary Chertoff. If and when Joe Biden is elected president, I think we would see a return to, I would say normalcy, but continued maturation of the Department of Homeland Security, which had begun under President Bush and was continued under President Obama. I think we will see a refocus on the critical risks facing the country and increased capacity in areas like cybersecurity and infrastructure protection. I think we will see the better development of means of communication across the federal government from DHS, but in particular with state, local, tribal, territorial governments and with the private sector. I think if there is to be a second term under President Trump, by this time in the second term, we'll be on our 11th or 12th secretary. We'll continue to have that kind of instability in leadership, which has just been crippling for this department. I think we will also see the conversion of the department. I really felt for the first 3 years that it was the Department of the Southwest Border. That was the only function of the department, where in fact its remit is much broader. With important missions that need to be focused upon. I think the future of the department in a second Trump term would be highly problematic.
Thank you. Secretary Johnson.
Thanks, Nick. A couple of points. First, I'd like to point out that President Trump has actually had 6 secretaries of Homeland Security. You're looking at his first for 7 hours and 32 minutes.
Okay.
During the day I was designated survivor, January 20, 2017, I was the entirety of President Trump's cabinet until John Kelly was confirmed by the Senate and sworn in. But on a serious note, first of all, I think it's notable that you have the 3 of us together here for one discussion, 1 Republican, 2 Democrats, spanning 2 different administrations, who would largely agree on the issues and agree on the future of the department. This president has used the Department of Homeland Security as a hammer to drive his very, very aggressive immigration message, which at times has boomeranged on him to the point where last year we had the highest level of apprehensions on our southern border in years, certainly preceding the time that Janet and I were in office. And now using DHS personnel for Portland and elsewhere to drive his reelection message, to the point where people are calling for the outright deconstruction of the department altogether. In my 3 years as secretary, I continually made a point of reminding the Congress and the American people that the Department of Homeland Security is a lot more than immigration. It is aviation security, it is maritime security, it is drug interdiction on the high seas, it's cybersecurity, it's protection of our national leaders through the Secret Service, and obviously it's the response to natural disasters. It's so much more than as Janet alluded to, the Southwest border. And so when it comes to the future of DHS, you have to have those functions, and they have to reside someplace in our national government. In my view, best to have all of those functions reside within one cabinet level department under the purview of one cabinet officer who has security as his or her core mission, not scattered all over the federal government, Treasury, Commerce, and the like, but centralized in one place. Should there be a change in policy direction? Yes. Should there be a change in tone? Yes. Does DHS need to continue to focus on management reform and a more mature bureaucracy? Yes, absolutely. But it serves the American people in vital ways to protect them on a daily basis.
You know, I'd like to talk for a second about this question of politicization. This is you know, something that is endlessly fascinating to me, and I'm a careful observer of the Twitter account of the acting deputy secretary Ken Cuccinelli, who's the senior official performing the duties of the deputy secretary. And you know, I noticed over the weekend on a day when we saw 120-degree temperatures there in California, and the threat of another explosion of wildfires was on everyone's mind there. The deputy secretary was tweeting about energy deregulation and how you know, it made a sort of an ideological case for you know, something that he favored. And it just struck me that we would have the number 2 official at our Homeland Security Department, rather than sending, you know, kind of a reassuring tweet to Americans and the millions of people who may be frightened by what they're seeing and these dramatic, you know, changes in weather and climate. But instead, it was an opportunity to make a political point. And so I want to ask if we have if after 3 years of this administration, it will be possible to depoliticize the DHS mission, particularly at a time when the kind of unifying mission that created the department to face external threats has in some ways you know, given way to an increasing focus on internal and domestic threats, whether that's white nationalism or unrest in the streets of U.S. cities. So maybe we can go backwards, and Secretary Johnson, how do you depoliticize? I mean, you faced in your term a lot of criticism for immigration enforcement practices, among other things. So what is the roadmap to regaining, you know, the kind of bipartisan trust and support that the department enjoyed in its founding?
2 things. One, continually remind the American people of all the different things, all the different ways in which Homeland Security protects us. You know, frankly, those of us here in the Northeast corridor, Janet's not one of them. She's out in California. We look at our national government through a certain lens, but on a day-to-day basis, when I interacted with members of the public when I was in office, they were more concerned about, for example, is it safe to send my kid to this country on spring break, or the last hurricane response. The American public tends to be focused day to day on things that matter to them in terms of their own public safety. But the direct answer to your question, I think, in terms of those who pay attention to the politics, I think it's incumbent upon the next administration, whoever that is, and I'd say this to the Trump administration as well as a Biden administration. It's got to start at the top. Appoint somebody who has an apolitical persona, somebody who is not identified sharply as a Republican or a Democrat who likes to tweet political messages, but somebody with a relatively apolitical background, so that we can restore the department to the place where I think it ought to be, which is a relatively apolitical department.
Thank you, Secretary Napolitano.
Yeah, I think it begins at the top, and it begins by appointing a secretary and top departmental leadership who have operational experience in some of the relevant areas of the department. Nobody has operational experience at all of the areas of the department, but at least a good portion of it. Someone who can be a trusted communicator, who will provide the American people and the various stakeholders of the department with accurate information without a politicized twinge to it. and someone who is really focused on educating the members of the public and departmental stakeholders, particularly the Congress, about the overall mission and missions of the department, what it is there to do, how it does it, and in so many respects does it well.
Secretary Trudeau.
I agree with everything that's been said. I would add that my experience is that when you get below the political appointees at the top level, I find dedicated career people who still believe in the mission, which actually is broadened. If you consider that we're dealing with cybersecurity threats, multiple terrorism threats, and obviously the huge impact of what's going on in California and hurricane season. But the next leadership of the department has to respect the chain of command, and the White House has to respect the chain of command. They can't reach around the leaders and try to meddle with the mid-level personnel. So to me, this is about restoring regular order, the norms that we all assume public servants honor, and having a sense of what the chain of command is that allows for a deliberate unity of effort.
Thanks. I mean, I don't want to wrap up until we do address some questions about immigration enforcement and the border. Now that the department has been operating in a lot of ways as the Department of Immigration Enforcement over the past 3 years. As you are all well aware, there's an enormous backlash against that part of the DHS mission. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of pressure that has been built up and that a Biden administration would face to radically depart from President Trump's immigration enforcement practices. I also think the last 3 years have really confirmed that migration patterns respond very rapidly to perceived changes in U.S. enforcement, and the prediction that we could face another border crisis or migration crisis immediately early on in a Biden administration is very real. So I wanted to ask all of you, having wrestled with this issue both operationally and politically, what do you think that a Biden administration could do to manage those pressures, both potentially at the border and from the left side of the Democratic Party? Secretary Chertoff, if you could start us off.
Well, I mean, I can't speak for what specifically what the policy would be, but I think we all share the view that you need to have control of the border. You need to do it, however, in a way that's not inhumane, so that separating kids from families, not keeping track of unaccompanied minors are failures. On the other hand, I would not expect a Democratic president to basically say open borders. I would expect him to say people who want to come in have to satisfy our requirements, and we will enforce the rules, but we'll do it in a way that's respectful of due process. In the long run, as I think all of us know, to really deal with the issue permanently, you need to have comprehensive reform that allows for people to come in and work temporarily, that has a reasonable adjudication of asylum applications, but that also, applies firm rules against people who don't take the legal pathways in and employers who want to exploit them.
Secretary Napolitano?
Yeah, I agree, and I think the message that would and should be sent by a Biden administration is that the border will be managed in accord with the rule of law, that it will be managed with the use of manpower and technology, not with resources spent on building a wall, and that at the same time, the administration is going to advocate for comprehensive reform. We tried during the Obama administration for comprehensive reform. A measure did get through the Senate, died in the House, was a lost opportunity. That issue continues to fester, and it will continue to fester without leadership from the White House, and I think President Biden would provide that leadership, and then a bipartisan agreement in the Congress.
Thank you. Secretary Johnson.
So immigration for 3 years was the bane of my existence. It was the toughest issue I worked on in public office, and that includes the Department of Defense as well as the Department of Homeland Security. You said something that I agree with entirely, and I almost said exactly the same thing time and time again, which is that migration patterns respond to perceived changes in enforcement policy on our southern border. That's something Mike Chertoff taught me when I had him in once for advice during a border surge. And it is so accurate because it goes into an echo chamber in Central America or in Mexico, it reverberates and people respond and there's a snowball effect, but it doesn't always respond in ways you might predict. You said something that some people are predicting if Joe Biden is elected president, that there'll be a surge somehow. I wouldn't count on that. Donald Trump was elected January 2017. The numbers went down for a while because he had campaigned on being tough on the border. But then in 2019, there were almost 1 million apprehensions on the southern border in his third year of office, which is way higher than anything that I certainly saw while I was in office. So it doesn't always respond in ways you might predict. Americans want us to treat those who are here fairly and humanely. I think they want to protect the dreamers. They want to take care of those who are de facto Americans, but Americans also want secure borders. They don't want a border that's out of control. And I believe Joe Biden believes that. If he is elected, I think he'll go about border security in a smart way that includes technology and a whole lot of other things that people have been recommending for years, and we'll go about it a smart way. And if it's anything like the last administration, we saw some pretty low numbers of apprehensions on our southern border while we were in office. So those are my thoughts.
Let me add one thing, and I suspect that my colleagues will agree with me. You also have to look at what drives people to migrate. And where you have violence and no order and fear, that's awfully hard to stop people from fleeing that. So it behooves us to actually work with the countries in Latin America to help them build up a rule of law and their economy. Because frankly, with that, many, if not most of the people coming north would be perfectly happy to stay at home.
That's absolutely correct, if I could agree. And anybody who's studied this issue, who's managed this issue, and had responsibility for it agrees. You've got to deal with the problem at the source. Not a lot of people want to hear that. We want quick and easy solutions like build a wall. But as long as the conditions are as bad as they are in Central America, people are going to keep coming, even if it means they only get to stay for a year or two while their asylum claim is pending.
That's right. And I think that as we start to see more possible effects from climate change, those pressures are going to increase. That is something else we've seen over the last couple of years. I want to go before we're out of time to some of our audience questions. We have one from Michael Che Kim, who asks about election security, which is also something that's on everyone's minds. He writes, Americans have lost faith in the electoral process and authorities from the local to the federal level. How do we restore that fundamental faith? Before that happens, how do we counter or protect the forces that are challenging that prerequisite faith? That's an important role for DHS. Secretary Johnson, what are your thoughts on election security?
Well, I sure hope Americans haven't lost faith in their democracy and our electoral process. It's going to be a challenge because we're talking about moving over 100 million mail-in votes over a very, very short period of time, which is the responsibility of the Postal Service and state election officials. My thought is this, notwithstanding today's scoop that people within DHS are being discouraged from talking about the issue, ODNI has been telling us loud and clear that the Russians and possibly others are at it again in terms of trying to influence our democracy and even again attempting to hack into our election infrastructure. So there are a lot of lights blinking hot red right now, and that's where I believe the concern needs to be focused over the next couple of weeks. I think the Russian government is a far greater threat to our democracy than the Postal Service, frankly.
Secretary Napolitano.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd like to hear more of from the administration is what they intend to do about the Russian interference in our elections. I think the intelligence about this is quite clear. But what is not clear is what we intend to do about it by way of sanctions, by way of deterrence. I think we ought to be sending those messages. And those messages really need to emanate from the White House.
Secretary Chertoff.
I guess I would say I actually don't believe the White House has credibility in this, because I think that President Trump has gone out of his way to come up with claims that are totally unsubstantiated about fraud and downplaying the Russians. And I think that the issue is not just the Russians, but frankly, domestic disinformation and disruption. Here, I think the state election authorities and the governors can step up and make a difference, particularly in those states where there's really going to be a close election. The governors have the ability to work with their law enforcement to, first of all, create as many opportunities as possible for people to vote using drop boxes or in person or facilitating the mail, but also to indicate that they're going to, if they can legally, expand the amount of time within which votes can be sent in, move it up so it can be earlier, and also put the resources into counting so that we get tabulations relatively quickly. These are concrete things that don't require Donald Trump's good faith. Every governor can take steps.
So on this topic of election interference and the story that we have out today with the whistleblower's complaint about the DHS Intelligence Office, I want to get to this question from Stephen Shapiro, who said, I led a project for business executives for national security, which in 2015 published a report on domestic security structures and processes. Mike Chertoff was part of that work. We looked at DHS, primarily its intelligence component, and found that entity wanting because of its ineffective efforts to develop a separate intelligence capability. 5 years later, should INA grow into the domestic intelligence agency or focus on managing those departments and of its internal components? INA, what is the right role for it, Secretary Chertoff?
I think INA is it's not really a prime collector. I mean, it relies on collection done elsewhere. What it can be is an analyst and also an educator, share with state and locals what they need to understand about what the threats are. And again, I mean, I think, when Charlie Allen was the head of INA, when I was there, he was a very, very experienced former CIA leader. He was very good at helping get the analysis done and getting it out there.
Thank you. Secretary Napolitano.
Yeah, that's what I meant in my initial comments, which is the communications from the department, and particularly the INA. It needs to be in real time. It needs to get out to the fingertips of America. And it needs to be value add. It needs to be intelligence of utility. And beyond that, which is viewed on television or in the newspaper. But the function of the department should be as a collector and a distributor particularly into the state and local ecosystem.
Well, what about the privacy concerns involved with DHS, particularly confronting more internal and domestic threats? We saw recently when the agency was gleaning information from Twitter, the kind of controversy that generated. So what is, what are there legitimate privacy concerns about INA's role going forward as domestic threats emerge as a greater focus for the department?
Well, to
Can
the
I answer
degree
that?
it's collecting domestic intelligence or collating domestic intelligence, it has to follow the same rules as our other domestic agencies do. And there's also, by the way, the rule of common sense, which has a role to play here.
Secretary Johnson, please. Secretary
Sure.
Johnson.
So the first time I found out, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
First time I found out DHS had an INA function, I asked, why does DHS have an intelligence function? And I was told vertical information sharing with state and local law enforcement. Michael is correct. They are not a prime collector themselves of intelligence. And that includes, frankly, in the domestic space as well. Most of the time, if you are seeing intel, law enforcement sensitive intel about domestic threats, it's going to be coming from the FBI. Where DHS contributes mostly in the intelligence space is through travel information of suspicious individuals who may be bound for the United States. And so, the story that the Post dropped today is curious because INA is not the prime collector of intel about what the Russians and others are doing internationally. And so, nor does the president in his presidential daily brief routinely read what is in INA products. So it's a very curious story.
We'll add that quote to the next edition of the story, Secretary Johnson.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's been a great discussion. I think it's time to turn it over to Caitlin. Are you there?
I am. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks again.
And thank you for moderating a great panel, and thank you to all the former secretaries. I am delighted to continue the conversation about the important role of the public-private partnership in the Homeland Security mission, and am very honored to be joined today by three friends and partners in the overall mission. Tom Fanning, who is the Chairman, President, and Chief Executive of Southern Company, a member of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, whose recommendations we reference in our report, and the chair of the Electric Sector Coordinating Council. Amy Rawl, who is Vice President of the Homeland and Justice Programs at SAIC and has long supported DHS mission critical programs. And last but not least, my good friend Jeanette Manfra, who is now the Global Director for Security and Compliance at Google, but previously served as the former Assistant Director for the Cybersecurity Division at the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency at DHS, which was the newly named NPPD where I came from. So thank you all for being here. I do want to remind our audience to please submit questions through the Q&A function, and towards the end of this panel, we will ask our distinguished panelists some of these questions. I want to start with or pick up with the threat conversation, and we didn't have a lot of time to go into it in the few minutes that Tom and I had, but in our report, we talk about the threats of foreign adversaries to our American democracy. We talk about climate change. We talk about these lower probability, high impacts events, COVID, the need to defeat it. And I'm curious, and I don't know if all of you caught the beginning of the session about the need to kind of routinize imagination, but from your perspective in your role in industry, what is the greatest threat that we face that we need to continue to use our imagination around and bring really the power of the collective Homeland Security enterprise to bear to defeat it? And Tom, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, great. We war game these things regularly. We have something called GridX, and it's some number. But I do think that it's going to be some sort of cyber attack, both a kind of virtual as well as potential physical assault on our nation's most critical infrastructure. That's what I think is kind of the biggest thing to watch out for. And that's where I think, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, as something like 85 to 87% of the most critical infrastructure in America is owned by the private sector. We need to think completely differently. We need to reinvent our imagination about how to secure America.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you and ask that question. Amy, let's go to you. What's the threat where we're not fully using our imagination yet?
I think I'm going to sound very similar to Thomas in that cyber is certainly top of mind. We had a briefing this week about how ransomware has become ransomware as a service on the dark web, and you can get tiers of support for how you have access to companies' data, corporations, highly sensitive material, how you can ask for certain companies to be targeted by your ransomware. And I mean, it's creating a whole different set of models of business on cyber warfare from both novice actors as well as nation state and other, kind of asynchronous actors that I think we're just beginning to see the tip of the iceberg on where that could go. I think it feeds right into Thomas's point on where it could end, but that's certainly top of mind for all of us. We're also very concerned about what that future individual motivated person who's not necessarily nation state, but certainly has intent to do harm, looks at what's happened with COVID and thinks about new and creative ways to introduce biological potentials into the United States, right? Where you could bring it in a petri dish into your bag. There's whole sets of conversations going on around that. And what do we need to do differently? Because we've demonstrated that you have a much more impactful death ratio than you did with airplanes on 9/11. And so who's motivated by that? And so those are, what worries me is those are all things that are in our current imagination, right? So we've said we haven't imagined enough. So then you think, well, that's a terrible list of horribles. How should we codify that imagination process to think of those other horribles that we haven't come to mind? Is it the creatives that need to come in and give us, the Z, stories that terrify you? I don't know.
The stuff that gets left on the cutting room floor. Yes.
Exactly. Great. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
All right, Jeanette, over to you. How would you answer that question? And you're on mute still.
Oh my gosh. You would think I would have that mastered. And, I would say that a little bit similar, but perhaps a different slant to it. Continuing on the great lessons that I learned from Suzanne Spalding and you, I think the work that I was probably most proud of was the establishment of the national critical functions and really how DHS sort of shifting to a function and systems oriented approach in thinking about what is it that needs to be protected in the US. And I think that was a very illuminating exercise. And I know they're continuing to do that, but from my perspective, it was thinking about from an adversary perspective. And to me, the sort of that worst case scenario, it would be the actual or even perceived disruption or degradation of those functions. And there's a lot of ways that you could sort of turn that, but working with the private sector and understanding, these are the kind of the key systems that underpin everything that we all cherish in our society, and not just the US and our partners as well. So to me, that's always kind of the, how can an adversary use all of the different tools, not just cyber. I think they're much more, clever than just having a very direct, focused vector, but where they would use all their different their tools in their toolbox to impact the again, either the perception or the actual degradation or disruption of those functions.
Okay, Jeanette, I'm going to just stick with you and ask you, what recommendations would you have for incoming leadership about how the department can enhance its collaboration with the rest of the enterprise to continue to improve response and overall resilience to some of these existential threats?
I think it's more of a continuing evolution and encouraging. We don't need to have big shifts. A lot of the laws, the policies, the groundwork has been set. What needs to be built is more capacity to build those plans against those how do we protect that resilience and those functions to ensure that those partnerships are deep. And so I think it's more of a that they're on the right course. Of course, I'm saying that because I was a part of that, so I'm a bit biased. But I really believe that with CISA, which really owns much of what we're talking about here, has gone through a long evolution with the 13 years that I was there, plus a few years before that, and they've got a really good course. And so now it's really about kind of building that capacity, building those partnerships, and having all those tools ready that when they're needed.
Amy, how would you respond to that question? You've worked across critical missions for many years now. How would you recommend that DHS improve its overall coordination with the enterprise?
Well, first I'd say to look at the study, because there's actually a lot of great recommendations. So it's a shameless plug for the document that was published today, but we outlined a number of places to attack and look at first. I think one of the things that we've all commented on is tabletop exercises and getting different stakeholders in a room together to do scenario-based planning and kind of walk through these events as they might happen to find gaps before they actually occur. That was something that we saw happening at one point in the department. They seemed to come away from it a little bit. Strongly encourage that to come back. I also liked the idea that I wanted to call out of rotational exercises that we've recommended, and that if you know one agency within inside DHS, you know them and they're very territorial and tribal and they come up that way and they're very passionate about their swim lane. I think having leaders spend time across those is a critical piece of this next evolution. And then the other thing that somebody told me recently that really struck me is that the younger generation that's coming into the workforce now does not have the context of 9/11 that we have. So we're all very impacted by that and what happened and the mission of Homeland and it's been 19 years, but these kids don't have that context of watching those planes and this week we're all kind of thinking about it, it's top of mind. And so getting that next workforce ready for the impossible and the improbable, and how they're ready to plug into DHS and to bring in that next generation of talent, I think is going to be really important.
Okay. Tom, basically the same question, but your involvement with the department started in 2012 when Secretary Napolitano helped reestablish the Electric Sector Coordinating Council. You've been at this at 8 years, bringing your industry to the table, to sit across the table from the federal government to talk about emerging threats. But you alluded in your opening comments that we need to kind of imagine what this relationship and collaboration, and I know that's a word that means a lot to you, collaboration. What recommendations would you have moving forward?
Well, yeah, I got to be punchy here. Otherwise, I'd take the rest of the time on our panel. But seriously, I think the work that CISA has done, evaluating the critical national functions, is really important. But we need to go much further. And what the Solarium report would show is the concept of SICI, unfortunately a named acronym, that basically stands for Systemically Important Critical Infrastructure. And what we need to do is drive all the way down to the asset level in the United States to determine what are the most critical assets, and then determine what layers of resilience, be they electricity, telecom, water, you name it, we need to have in place. And then to create another recommendation, a joint analytic environment where the concept of sharing becomes obviated. And in fact, the idea of protecting SICI assets at this level becomes a joined obligation of the intelligence community, sector-specific agencies, the private sector, Department of Defense, U.S. Cyber Command, et cetera. All this would be housed within DHS. DHS, therefore, becomes the playing field on which we carry out these critical functions. It is a completely different mindset than the way we operate today. and for all the good work in Congress about we need to do more sharing, et cetera, et cetera. I think that needs to leave the playing field. You know, I've said before, I remember I was on Maria Bartiromo's show telling her, what does this stuff look like? And it's like walking on the beach, looking out over the ocean and saying there's a submarine battle going on out there. You can't see a thing. We know it's ongoing. We know it's lethal. The only time you ever see anything is when something cataclysmic happens. And we all know that there is a whole lot of activity left of boom. We've got to get our act together as a nation in classified space and make it actionable in unclassified space to protect the nation. It is a completely different obligation and way we act than what we have today.
I want to pull the string on the concept of a SICI, strategically, systemically important critical infrastructure.
You bet.
What expectations would you levy on industry, and what support would you be looking for from the federal government if you were designated a SICI?
Now, we can get aspirational pretty quickly, but the idea of the aspiration would be something like this. So say, for example, Southern Company's building the first nuclear plant in a generation of Americans. I would love to have complete real-time information and perhaps presence of folks like FBI, NSA, US Cyber Command, and others on my networks around that important asset. Now, whether that qualifies as a SICI asset, I'm just using it as an example. But it is a joint effort. We know, and there was a lot of debate on the Solarium Commission about the benefits and burdens of that relationship. It is clear to me as a CEO that I get a lot of value out of having real-time presence on my networks. And I know a lot of people wouldn't feel that way. But I think in the national interest, that in fact is what we must aspire to do for these critical infrastructure assets. The burdens will be things like a formal legal obligation, say through Sarbanes-Oxley, for accounting firms to evaluate the cyber hygiene of important companies that do involve themselves as SICI assets to determine, as a matter of their control evaluation, are they doing what they need to do in order to protect the national interest? That would be signed off by me, a CFO, and our board of directors. And I can tell you that will get people's attention. But those are kind of the benefits and burdens we would have.
Okay. I want to pick up on another recommendation that was part of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, but has been really since the publication of the Executive Order 13636 around cybersecurity, you know, the need to continue to incentivize industry to embrace security. And one of the ways that we've done it in the federal government is through the acquisition process, DFARS, and now CMMC. And I'm going to start with Amy on this question and then come back to Jeanette and then you, Tom, about how you're using acquisition and procurement to drive security through your supply chain. But Amy, how has DFARS and CMMC been effective in helping raise the level of security and drive supply chain resilience?
I mean, it certainly put a stake in the ground for us as integrators, prime contractors doing business with the government that we are accountable for our entire supply chain of vendors that are coming to perform work for the government. And so in the past, I think all of us were concerned about it, but it's really crystal clear now of the expectations, how we hold small businesses accountable and responsible. And if you go back to that, ransomware as a service, right? It's the small businesses that we're seeing have more risk than a large company like SAC that invests in a huge cyber posture, right? So we've done a lot of pivoting and a lot of investment in our procurement processes, engaged our corporate CISOs team so that they're part of that. It's part of our small business mentorship now. So it's really infiltrating and expanding across all of our different touch points with our supply chain. But the government's absolutely expecting it and rightly should.
Jeanette, whether you wear your CISA hat or your Google hat, talk to me a little bit about the role of regulations and standards in the procurement process.
I think kind of with the DHS perspective, I think we had made a lot of good progress in being smart and helping. A lot of it was really about educating procurement officials on potential cybersecurity risks through third party, and I think great work in getting to the legislation that stood up the Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Council, and I know that a lot of that work is continuing. I think from a Google perspective, supply chain security was sort of core to what we do, independent of kind of incentives from government, and have had a really long history of building strong supply chain security, just as in sort of a need to ensure the security of our company. So I don't necessarily, and I think I would agree with a lot what Amy talked about in terms of smaller companies. There's sort of different challenges that they face, and so I think the important thing about incentives is, being clear about what practice are you trying to incentivize, what specific problem are you trying to solve, and not trying to take sort of a global approach to very local, discrete problems. That's always the challenge, especially with supply chain. Even the word supply chain means a lot of different things to different people. So I think, so that's sort of been my perspective and what I've learned on this over the past few years.
Tom, how are you addressing this?
Yeah. I'm going to take a different swing at that one. I don't think we've been very good at all as a nation on securing the supply chain. I don't think we've been very late in sharing or moving away from classified information into something that we can all act upon. I think that's one of the things this recent executive order was trying to get at least in our industry, especially with respect to the sanctity of the bulk transmission system. We need to do a whole lot better there. I completely understand the complexity and the legal challenges that you will face, but boy, oh boy, we need to do that. Solarium took a swing at it also, and it's an imperfect idea, but the old UL Labs approved kind of electrical equipment. It's not enough to say that something is cyber secure. What the real meat of the process would be is to certify that you have a process to keep the widget or the system cyber secure over time. And so that there will be patches made on a timely basis, et cetera, et cetera. And it really depends on the depth of the exposure to an existential threat that this widget or system would have. But that's something that we need to do much better on too. Within our own industry, we are self-evaluating. For years, we've had something called INPO, Institute of Nuclear Power Operators. Well, what we're trying to do now is create kind of a cyber maturity model that would evaluate, I forget how many things we're testing, something like 120 or so, and we're filling out a self-report. We would intend over time to move to an independent organization that would evaluate, in fact, how well we're doing as companies. So we need to adopt a certain set of not only what's, but how's, the behaviors, and the systems we will have in place to assure we have cybersecurity, cyber hygiene going forward. Let's get the headlights on.
Okay, thank you. Jeanette, in the report, we make a recommendation that threats to critical infrastructure, in particular systemically important critical infrastructure, be given priority across the intelligence community, and that collection priorities should include threats against critical infrastructure companies. What recommendations would you have for the intelligence community? Jeanette, I'll start with you and then go to Tom and Amy.
I think I would really refer back to our first conversation, is that intelligence community really through DHS, and they need to have a deep level of understanding of how these systems work. And it's not, about under having sensors on every single network. That's not what I'm referring to. It's really about how does this critical system actually function across multiple organizations? Because one thing I learned was that we were really only hitting that sort of tip of the iceberg in that level of understanding. And to be able to enable the intelligence community to be able to have that focus on, well, how could an actor potentially disrupt these functions? There needs to be that deep level of understanding, and it needs to be refreshed, because many industries are changing quite significantly. And so that understanding of who are these critical partners, who needs to know what type of information, what can they do with that information? You know, we have these good legal and policy frameworks, but to be able to operationalize it, that level of understanding, and that only is going to come from having a really deep trusted relationship with industry. And I would add state and locals, who are also a really critical partner on this.
Okay, Tom.
Hey, yeah, look, I couldn't agree more with that, but let me just add to it as well. When we did one of these GridX exercises, we got to an enormous problem where we war gamed out the president enacting the FAST Act. The Secretary of Energy was able to now do something with the utility industry to protect America. But obviously, people in government don't know what to do. They need to look at people like me or the ESCC or what have you in order to take the right steps. There is no playbook. We always invent one on the fly. So here's the thing that I want people to consider. While the intelligence community has a great deal of information and they're very valuable, there is really a two-way benefit here of them understanding what is important to us. I think people would be surprised at where the existential threat may reside inside the electricity industry, rather than what people kind of generally think about. As well, that would illuminate their own activities, and specifically US Cyber Command. If they had insight on our networks as to how they really work and how we protect ourselves, frankly, that gives them some insight to play offense better in this evolving concept, again, Solarium report, whether it's defend forward, persistent engagement. We would have a better offensive capability. The better offensive capability we have, the less likely the bad guys are to try to do something stupid.
Great answer. Thank you. Amy.
Yeah, I was thinking about how as we saw different threat vectors happen on different problems, we created whole programs of record that actually then gathered data, created responses, engaged and collaborated with the industry partners. So if you look at how airlines are required to share different data sets than they used to, right? How cargo sends different manifests than they used to, right? We all change how we're gathering data in within DHS to make better decisions. And to Thomas's point, have that two-way program back and forth where you get a benefit as an industry partner, as well as the government gets benefit because they're actually making us more safe and secure. You know, you could imagine DHS extending where they are now into that space, right? I think, Thomas, you said it, collaboration and data analytics, right? There's a lot of data that needs to be gathered, managed, and captured. The policy in many cases is there. So I think I'm going to sound very redundant to my two panelists here in that operationalize it, use your imagination, think of the worst thing that could happen, right? What's your 9/11 of this industry? And then start to walk back from that on what would you do to prevent it before it actually happens.
Hey, Caitlin, let me jump in on that too, because we really didn't underline the word collaborate. We fought very hard inside the report not to cooperate, not to share. The collaboration word is specific in that it indicates a joint accountability to protect America from that existential threat.
Okay. Amy, I want to come back to you as someone who has spent many years supporting the critical missions of DHS, and every component is different, and yet every component has some sort of relationship with the private sector, right, and its own authorities that govern that relationship. What recommendations would you make to an incoming secretary about how DHS can improve the overall coordination of its relationship with industry, given the uniqueness and how broad those relationships extend?
So I have a very practical example, but I think an important one.
Okay.
I'm always practical. If you look at the DHS procurement offices writ large, they have significant vacancies. They are struggling with the amount of things that they need to get and acquire, and they are struggling with the pace of change. Not because they don't want to go fast, but they don't, many times even the workforce or volume to go as fast as they need to go. I think focusing on how to really strengthen that core, give them the ability to do OTAs, which are other authorities to purchase, give them the ability to be more innovative than they already are with different acquisition strategies. One of, as an industry partner that we find they're struggling with is there's an immediate need from a mission operator. They need something now. There's new technology, there's an innovative product, there's an innovative company, and then you're looking at a 6-month lead cycle to get that company engaged in the department. That's just too long in this era. And so focusing on that very practical thing could get a lot of velocity and I think create a lot of momentum within the department.
Jeanette, your thoughts on how the relationship with industry can be better coordinated across the department?
I will second Amy's points. I think that we've obviously covered a lot, and the point on collaboration is really important. I think the one thing I would add would be very clear outcomes of what we're trying to achieve, and don't try to make partnerships be everything to everybody. And, so sort of be focused on, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? Does this group have the capability to do it? Is that framework in place and everybody's comfortable with what that looks like and what that plan is, and then execute on that? I think oftentimes government likes to, it just sets things up that can be very static. And so trying to sort of create these large mega structures to try to solve too many problems means that people end up focusing on maybe very basic things and not making as much progress as we'd like.
Tom, how would you answer that question? Your company touches many parts of the department. How can the department increase its overall collaboration with you?
I would argue under Chris Krebs, they've been doing a fabulous job. We handle everything from cybersecurity and physical security to storms, to COVID, to you name it. And we have DHS representatives on every call for every storm when we have a national response event. They do a really good job. Here's my view. I think DHS gets involved in too many blanket pulls across the other cabinet officers and Congress. Part of our recommendations is to cut through, as we have in the intelligence side of the world, a select committee structure. Something like 17 different committees in Congress, for heaven's sakes, deal with cyber, which is ridiculous. You can't get anything done. Inside the White House, having somebody in charge that cuts across many of the interests of different cabinet officers. Fully fund CISA the way it should be. Another kind of reimagining staffing. Caitlin, when you and I worked together, you were just fabulous, and Chris Krebs has been fabulous. I don't see, you guys are true patriots. You don't get paid nearly what you're worth to America. And so one thing I would think about doing in this space, if we carry kind of 85% of the weight, get these personnel inside government, particularly in leadership, on private pay scales. I would add staff with the old kind of GE internal audit idea of rotating staff from the private sector through government and back again. And that would, I think, help us create this joining of accountability and really learning the challenges that each of us face. I think the problems that we face today are more out of ignorance and lack of clarity of organization, rather than they are somebody having a different point of view. It was so interesting as we came forward with Solarium, and I walked the halls of Congress as much as anybody. So many people in Congress want to do something. They understand what a big threat this is. They don't know what to do. Again, it's that submarine battle. Inside DHS, I think you got much better clarity, but you don't have the freedom to do what you need to do. So we need this convening of the private sector working with CISA and DHS to get clarity of mission and the ability to move forward.
Okay, I'm going to turn to audience questions, and I'm going to take a question from Chapel Lawson. Jeanette, to your point about outcomes, although Tom, you're front and center in the Hollywood Square, so I'll start with you. Has the federal government ever clearly articulated what it wants with regard to civilian cybersecurity, and what level of security is important? And then there's a follow-on, which is, has the government ever articulated the roadmap from wherever we are now to that desired end state?
No, but no administration has. And I think the answer is it depends. And what we tried to do at Solarium was to say, for these existential threats, we've identified these assets, which are deemed to be systemically important. And then we would move forward with a set of classified and unclassified relationships, a joint analytic environment, and a completely 180-degree turn on how we're going to team on protecting those assets and therefore protecting America. One more thing. And in fact, this is in Solarium also, but I've been kind of interested in this one. Remember Smokey the Bear. Remember, don't be a litter bug. This is something that we need to do much more broadly across American culture, and that is turn people on to the threats that are out there. You know, as we move to online banking and Venmo and everything else that is now becoming part of our culture, people don't have a clue, generally speaking, as to how to protect themselves. We need a national campaign to inform the public.
All right, Amy, I'll go to you, and then Jeanette, I'll let you have the last word on that one.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. You know, from how we do business with the government, I think CMMC is starting to address that. The deforest clauses in the State 100, they're all policy and clear direction about what should be happening and how we engage. I think where Thomas is directed on what should private sector be doing and what standards should we hold our infrastructure to, that's a fantastic point that can't be said enough. As a person who's responsible for troubleshooting my 75-year-old mother's IT on a regular basis, and like, please stop clicking that link, it still falls, right? We certainly could do more to help our citizens with better tools and services as well. US CERT tries, but it's drinking from a fire hose every day, right? And so I wonder how to get that better, smarter, faster. And probably this is a great segue into Jeanette on how Google can help. So.
All right, Jeanette, over to you.
I think I would want people to be looking at the NIST cybersecurity framework. I do think that there's sort of several aspects, as you've now seen, of how you could take that question. I do think that the government has been fairly clear when it comes to an approach, having a risk-based approach, these types of controls. I think what Thomas is talking about is a different aspect of it that by necessity haven't been as clear. But in terms of like a baseline set of practices, I think the government has been clear about those. Now there's, sort of adding to that about what are the best ones that will be the most successful. That's always a hard thing to, figure out in security. I think we have a pretty good track record of understanding what those are at Google, of course, and things that we've done to make ourselves more secure, which of course allows our customers to be more secure. But I do think from a baseline level, to Tom's cyber hygiene point, and the things that every organization should be doing, they should really look to NIST and those controls that they've published.
Okay. All right. Last question, and then I'll turn it over to Barry Pavel. Comes from Scott Tousley, who asks how, and I think it's appropriate, brings us full circle, how can DHS adapt as called for, imagination and public-private creativity, and yet also get more governmentally mature, as they seem to be conflicting drivers? Amy, I'll start with you on that one.
I mean, that's like the most existential question ever, right?
Yeah.
Well, first I would say that, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, the workforce in there wants to be that, right? And so we need to all give them a kudos for having, the will and the passion to solve these incredibly hard problems that are in contradiction to each other. From a, taking that to the next step, though, to push back into that study, there's a lot that was shown in the workforce studies about not understanding how people fit into the mission, where they fit into the mission, how training and development can help encourage that innovation. And I think being very specific about these outcomes that I think, come again full circle on, right? Defining them, being clear on them, being hyper-focused on the ones that are at the top priority for all of us and top of mind right now. And I would even argue that they need some more people to help. There's not enough workforce to boil this ocean, right? And there's a lot that they're being asked to do. If we really want to say that DHS is, that we're the group that's protecting the non-military threats, right? Then that's a really tall order and needs some energy and focus behind it.
Okay. Jeanette, I'll go to you and then Tom, give you the last word.
I think that that is a very existential and esoteric question. Leave it to Scott to answer that one. I think that a lot of it is happening. As was mentioned, there are, we talked about Chris and the great work that's going on there. There's other parts of the department where you've got leaders who are thinking about how do I empower my workforce? How do I ensure that they have the ability to make decisions in the moment when they need to make them and not have too much bureaucracy, but also have enough maturity to be able to enable that innovation. And so there's always a tough balance. That was something we spent a lot of time at CISA maturing that and trying to strike that right balance. I think there's a lot to learn from the private sector in that space. And so I would it would really be, I think, about continuing to think about how do you build a culture where people understand the parameters of the decisions that they can make and then are empowered and have the cover to be able to make those decisions as they best are able to.
And Tom, to you, I am curious, as probably the CEO of an organization that is maybe very mature, but may not have the necessary imagination, and you can push back on that. But how would you answer Scott's esoteric and existential question?
Yeah, see, you started on this almost initially, and it was this idea of reimagining.
Yeah.
Reimagine, reinvent. I really think when you get to this idea of identifying what is an existential threat to America, and I think we're off to a good start. And I think when you identify then the assets that are critical to our national interest, then you create this joint analytic environment. I really think CISA is not kind of this governmental body. It really becomes a public-private partnership with different pay scales, different kind of operating characteristics. It would look more like a private company than it would a government bureaucracy. And I think it needs tremendous investment. When you think about the risk, if you do risk-weighted evaluations, the risks that we're talking about, they're so hard for other people to see. We tend to operate on a shoestring budget. We really need to breathe oxygen into this effort because I believe it is one of the biggest threats to our national security that exists today. This needs to be viewed as important as our DoD budget. And so let's think about it completely differently and think about it as a public-private enterprise, not just a government operation.
All right. Thank you very much. That will conclude the panel. Thank you all for your time and for the wonderful discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Barry Pavel, who is Senior Vice President and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, to provide final comments and close us out. Barry?
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And boy, this has been a really great set of conversations, just really full of really important insights. Thanks to all of you who were attending and contributing to what we really think is a beginning for us. And it's a beginning because we now have a report from the Scowcroft Center's new Forward Defense team that represents the first major non-governmental review of DHS since 2004. It's chock full of specific and in some cases urgent recommendations for defending the United States against adversaries. And these are adversaries who are currently, right now, waging non-kinetic war against us. So now we really want to work with all of you, and everyone has a role to play to help turn these important recommendations into actual policy and real action. Since we're essentially on the cusp of a new era of history this decade, and amidst this historic pandemic, it's really no surprise at all that we need to realign our government and other structures to protect our way of life, our economy, and our security. Many of you in the audience typically join our Scowcroft Center events for your interest in national security. Yet, as our speakers today drove home, including this last excellent panel, there are threats to all of us here in the homeland that are structural and in some cases existential, including the pandemic, ongoing attacks on democracy, cyber, climate change, and DHS, not DOD, and not another civilian agency like DOJ, is really best suited to defend against these non-military threats. Our adversaries have found a way to attack us through non-military means that sidestep America's unrivaled military power. They're attacking us, as we've heard, in our civilian networks, our critical infrastructure, even our smartphones. And so foreign efforts to divide the American people, increase polarization, even incite violence, they're intended to really weaken the US's ability to govern itself, much less to continue to lead in the world with democratic allies and partners and others. DHS certainly has a lot of work to do internally, starting with improving employee morale. DHS, as the report suggests, should build itself into a culture of cultures and reform some of its management practices to effectively do the job that all of us heard outlined over the last couple of hours. And Congress has a central role to play as well, including reforming oversight of DHS. So I am very grateful to our senior advisory board of former secretaries and acting secretaries, and to the group of more than 100 Homeland Security experts who contributed to this unbelievable report. I'm deeply indebted to the leadership of Tom Warwick. He's just been unstoppable, driving this entire effort with his co-director, Caitlin Durkovich, who was just superb, and to Program Assistant Mark Massa in the Scowcroft Center for his persistent, thoughtful, and strategic marshaling of this entirely new line of work for the Atlantic Council. Mark is the MVP. Thanks, as always, to the rest of our Atlantic Council team, including our communications and events teams, for their help today. Please stay tuned for more on this set of issues next month as we look to sustain the Scowcroft Center's important work on Homeland Security. Next up will be a discussion, some content on how to enhance congressional oversight of Homeland Security, and there will be more after that as well. Until then, thank you all so much for joining us. A lot more to do. Please stay engaged. Please keep sending us your contributions and your thoughts, and have a very good evening.